So this problem, people are going crazy over. People are getting 1 or 9 for this problem. So let's go over kind of how people are getting those two answers. So we have way number 1 and way number 2. In both examples, they're doing what's in parentheses first. 6 divided by 2, and then they add 1 and 2. But here's the problem. A lot of people think, oh, parentheses come before everything else. So they multiply 2 times 3 and get 6, and then they divide 6 by 6 and get 1. Here, we treat it as multiplication, so division comes first since it's left to right, and then we get 3 multiplied by 3, which is 9. So there's the two answers that people are getting. But before we go and explain these, this is the fundamental problem with math nowadays. As math teachers, we overall do a poor job because we want to teach tricks. We want to teach rules without going into the understanding of math and why it works. So a lot of people think, PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Okay, these are fine, but if you don't teach the understanding behind it, then you've done nothing more than teach a trick that's not going to work. You have to teach the understanding behind it. So PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. First off, parentheses is not the only grouping symbol. Here's where people go wrong. They think that because they see parentheses, you have to do the parentheses first, without explaining that parentheses only means you do what's inside the grouping symbols. Just because there's parentheses on this step right here, just because it's parentheses does not mean it's done first. Just because this 2 is next to this 3 with parentheses does not mean you do that first. Let's go ahead and take a look at several other ways that this could work. And this is where the true understanding of math comes into play. Here's what some other people do. Some other people will say, well, I can distribute that 2. I can take that 2 and I can multiply it in and get 6 divided by 2 plus 4. And then they look at it as like in parentheses, and then 6 divided by 6 gives you 1. That would be true if you're doing something like this. If you're taking 6 divided by the entire quantity, which in that case you would have to have grouping symbols around it or brackets or whatever. But this is what we look at. In this problem, you have to understand that we really only have 2, besides the addition here, we have 2 operations, division and multiplication, neither of which are actually inside parentheses. So therefore, we have to go left or right. So if we wanted to look at it a little differently, we could do this. 6 divided by 2 multiplied. Now, you can use an X or whatever for multiplication, but you could write it like this. Which, if this is the case, we go left to right. So really, this is 6 divided by 2, which is 3, multiplied by 1 plus 2. And we have 2 ways we can do that. We can take 3 times 3, which gives us the 9, or 3 times 1 plus 2, we distribute and get 3 plus 6, which also gives us 9. So looking at any of these ways would also be correct. Lastly, looking at this, if you remember from elementary school or junior high, when you do things like this, we have to understand that things can be written differently. 3 minus 2, for example, is the same as 7 plus a negative 2. We should be fluent in understanding that subtracting is the same as really adding a negative. The same thing is true when you do things like this. 10 divided by 2 is really multiplication. And it's 10 multiplied by a half. So if we're looking at it this way, 6 divided by 2 is the same as taking 6 multiplied by a half times 1 plus 2. And in that case, you could go further. You could take 6 times a half. And 6 times a half is 3, which then 3 times 3 is 9. In addition, we could actually multiply the 1/2. 6, we distribute the 1/2. That gives us 6 times. 1/2 times 1 is 1/2, sorry. 1/2 times 2 is 1. And then 6 times 1 and 1/2. Well, what's 6 times 1 and 1/2? Well, 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times a half is 3. That gives us 9. Any of these ways would be an acceptable way to get the correct answer of 9.